Welcome to the Ancient Robot. Oh, that was a bit too professional. You know what? That was very uncomfortable. That went back to my old, presentation days.
Dougal, why are we here?
Why are we here? Well, we're here with our sponsorship from... No. Welcome to the Ancient Robot podcast. As always, we're here to talk about board games, RPGs, all sorts of things that are involved in games and game design. My name is Dougal, the person who runs Ancient Robot Games up here in Edinburgh, joined by my co-host,
Gelb. My name is Gelb. I introduced myself on your behalf. I'm a local game designer and for some reason, the sidekick in this enjoyable experience.
Definitely co-host. And we're joined by our special guest today, Joe Murphy, a local psychologist who has a lot to do with games in general.
Been gaming a long time, and I'm what's called an early career psychologist, meaning I don't have one yet.
Oh, a career or a psychologist?
A career.
Oh, okay, Colin, that makes a lot more sense. Cool. So you obviously have been into Ancient Robot Games a bunch. You've been a big proponent of a lot of games that we've had in, including Crokinole, which I know you're a big fan of. What else has led you into games in general?
For me, they're creative and social. For some people, they're mostly social. But games really clicked for me about 20, 25 years ago, spending time on the Forge, looking at kind of comparisons between role-playing games, literature, and other things we might not necessarily assume are part of the same dynamic. So more recently, I've been studying how people join and leave groups. I still don't know how it's done, but it happens all the time. I made a little spreadsheet the other day. I really like spreadsheets. Excel is my pal. And I think I've played 150 separate games and over 1,000 sessions of gaming, of role-playing games.
Oh, yeah.
And so I've joined lots of groups and I've left lots of groups, and I still don't know how that works, how we do it so well. You can meet somebody at a convention and have a sparkling conversation, a wonderful game that's funny and interesting and moving, and you say goodbye after a couple of hours. And how did that happen? And there aren't many hobbies where we do that.
It's very true. And then keeping those people around can sometimes be difficult because life gets in the way and all the other bits and pieces.
So if we know that we're going to be leaving groups, can we plan for it? Can we do a better job at saying, let's move on now, or build a story arc into a game so we know there's definitely 6 sessions?
And part of your research, your most recent research, that was one of the kind of core components in terms of what it is that you were looking at. Is that right?
Yeah. I joined a couple of groups at Ancient Robot. There was one where we hadn't had a conversation about preferred pronouns. And about halfway through, I realized my character was trying to avoid using pronouns completely, which is ridiculous, rather than interrupt and say, can we just go back to that first step? So there was something there in how the creative side of gaming was being influenced by the social side, and the social side was being influenced by the creative. And I wanted to get to grips with that. And because we don't often talk about role-playing games as a group, and because it's a little under-researched, quite under-researched, we all assume our own experiences are universal. I had that conversation with somebody in the shop the other day who said most gamers believe, and I thought, we haven't done a survey, we don't know that.
So do you want me to start doing surveys? Is this what you're telling me? I need to survey people?
That would be so helpful.
Most gamers would want you to do a survey.
So I think it's really interesting from my perspective as someone who runs a lot of RPG events and lots of people coming in who are either completely new to it or are looking for a group because they used to have one and didn't have it. That first step of getting into particularly role-playing games. It happens with board games as well of, oh gosh, I don't know anything. How do I do this? It's weird how, if I think back into my own history, I don't really know how I did it. I can't look back and find that direct position of like, this is that thing that started me to have this group that I played with all the time. I think it's one of those things. It's weird. It reminds me a little bit of dating. It's kind of when it works, it happens really organically. But we have a lot of people come in who are like desperate to try and get it going. So we do have the space for that, which is really good. But we very much focus on having like beginner friendly sessions so that more people can get into it. And that's how they start. Do you remember your first RPG experiences?
Yeah. In my research, I was curious how rulebooks frame that question. How do you meet these people? How on earth do you meet these people? My first gaming sessions were with my neighbor, and I lived in the country outside Dublin, so there wasn't anybody else. So we were stuck. And for, 10 years, we got into fighting fantasy and miniature painting, and it was just me and him doing duo games the whole time. Mm-hmm. When I moved into Dublin then and started meeting wider groups, just hovering between different groups was quite a common experience for me for a couple of years. Gaming conventions were amazing for that. But there wasn't, unlike Ancient Robot, there wasn't a space to game in. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a consistent time of the week or a slot to play in. So you could take weeks putting together a group that was functional. Actually, with Ancient Robot, that's the first time I've ever consistently played in a store, in a kind of public space, which I initially found strange and intimidating, and I realize is probably a default for a lot of players.
It's interesting because we did have to manacle you to the table to get you to stick around. No, it's a strange one for me too, because it's very much something that I have been doing at my flat, or it's around at someone else's flat. Someone's really wanting to tell a story or run something that they think is really exciting. And then you go, oh yeah, I'll go and do that. And then that just kind of spreads and you kind of get more and more into it. But yes, there's a lot of the beginning or joining and leaving group side of stuff that I find so strange, because it is, as you were saying with what you're talking about with your research, there is no direct track for it. There is no like, oh, this is how you join a group. This is when you leave a group or anything else like that. Whenever I've left groups, it's almost never been because, this isn't going well. It's been because things go on in people's lives and the same people can no longer meet. It's rarely one person leaves and one person comes in. It's usually
like a Thunderdome.
Yes, only one can survive. No, it's not. It's not a stranger takes the place of someone who you knew who was part of that group. It's usually a whole group stops and then a whole new group starts.
I'm curious about how that whole group actually forms, or at least what you've maybe found or are looking at that, because a couple things jump into my brain. Like one is you have the macro sense, if you want to call it that, of like, how are role-playing games supposed to be done? You watch something like Critical Role, so that means every role-playing game needs to be like Critical Role. Then is that what you're expecting when you're going into a game? Then you start to see that different people have different preferences. Are they wanting to, are they wanting to put on characters? Are they not? Are they wanting a lot of interaction that is outside of the actual gameplay, or not? Do they prefer GMs that really love taking you on tangents, or are they quite a stickler for what the heck's going on? And I find that really, as someone who I'm not part of consistent RPG like groups, but I've played quite a few one shots, or I've come in as like a one-time character, and I've always been both surprised and also terrified of the idea of getting into a group, feeling the social pressure to say, this is the group, you will enjoy this group and you will all work together, and not necessarily have people start to irritate each other, if that makes sense, which I know happens.
That's your first fear.
Of course, that's your first fear. But I guess I'm curious about all of this happens in terms of you opting in or opting out into a group of people, into a friend group, over multiple much shorter interactions. You all go hang out in the pub. There's one guy that's there that you're like, I really get on with you. Yeah, I think I'll spend more time with you. Maybe another one saying, you're not really my cup of tea, so I don't need to do that. An RPG feels like a whole bunch of expectation and pressure is kind of built up. I don't know if I'm hopefully leading to a question, I promise. But how do you find in your research, how do you find people are like navigate that so I wouldn't say effortlessly, but subconsciously, if maybe that's not the right word. But.
Well, if you were to look at the rule books, so I looked at, I was curious if there was material out there, and D&D and Apocalypse World, two very, very influential games for obvious reasons, for two different styles of gaming, but they're the heavy hitters. Both say, start with a bunch of friends. That's not very clear to me. Or D&D says, play with a bunch of people and they will become your friends. That's a bold assertion. It's probably true. You will probably make friends from a D&D group.
They're so long. You're spending so much time together that it makes sense that you're willingly putting yourself through potentially a lot of pain. So it will just be easier for you just to become friends with a group of people.
I was going to say, I think there's something about that group dynamic side of having a singular focus for yourselves as a group, in the same way as playing board game and things. You often won't know that you don't get on with someone, even after you have been playing multiple sessions with things, because you're all different characters or you're all focusing on something to do together. So having that actionable step can often disregard a lot of the regular issues that might come up with social interactions with certain people who you don't get on with.
But especially because RPG role-playing games of all sorts also attract people who might feel like they have social interaction challenges in other formats. It gives them a format that they can shed a little bit of that concern and open themselves up, take on a character, all that kind of stuff. It allows you that sense, that opportunity for vulnerability that maybe you don't feel as comfortable displaying elsewhere. But at the same time, it's putting up all these potential blockers to that, simultaneously, which I just find very interesting. Is like, as someone who is neurodivergent, you're going in very, very like kind of slightly. I don't necessarily think about this stuff all the time, but you're going into a social situation. You're making a whole bunch of assumptions very, very quickly about people, and you're also making assumptions about what they think about you. And I just feel like the idea of getting in for 4 hours with a group of people that you've never met before, it should be more intimidating than it is. And why isn't it as intimidating? Why can it sometimes not be as intimidating as you think it should be?
That's a lot of good points. I think so. My most recent study was a series of interviews with gamers I'd met through the shop, and I interviewed them very loosely, a little bit like this kind of chat that was kind of wide ranging and focused in on areas I thought were interesting. Transcribe the interviews and look for recurring themes. And one of the participants reckoned gaming was for communication nerds, people who are nerdy about communication, about how talking is done, about how people meet. And they might feel that they're socially unprepared, but they're actually quite good at it because they're thinking about it so much. Mm-hmm. When I looked at game, I was looking at sort of adjacent hobbies or adjacent activities, and I was thinking about musicians and jam sessions, and the way that musicians can come together in a pub, find a rhythm together, perform, riff off each other, produce something very beautiful at the end, very interesting, and might never see each other again. And they do that by having this creative focus. The creative thing is maybe the elephant in the room. It being the focus means you can always back off from the social engagement and let the creative voice. Somebody was telling me about this idea the other day, the spirit of the game. What was it, Spielgeist? That there's something else at the table. There's another invisible participant. And so they take away some of the pressure. That invisible game entity takes away some of the pressure. Yeah,
it takes some of that weight of expectation in terms of, well, that's what I'm supposed to be doing right now. So, if I don't do it quite right, well, maybe it's not necessarily all me that's failing in this social situation. It's also that the game is permitting me to. So maybe that's an expected outcome, which is just quite interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way.
And one of the strongest themes, and I'd like to spend a lot more time in it personally, not right now, was how we use social energy to patch up creative dissent or discord, and how we use creative energy to patch social problems. So there was a lovely example of a player who saw at the table that GM was struggling to find a rule in a rule book. And so started wittering in character with somebody else at the table and invented a whole little plot line, a whole reason for two characters to argue that was, like, in a way, purposeless. It didn't have any stakes, but they were doing it so the GM could just focus and find that page in the book. That's interesting if you think about it. We don't get that in a lot of other art forms where you take time to let the director of a movie pick a lens and just go act and improvise. But gaming allows us to do that. Similarly, we use, let's say, like a thing I've noticed recently was when games start late because somebody hasn't, I'm not going to name any names right now, but when people forget an Uber takes time to get from one side of the city to another.
Let's talk about you, Delilah.
Delilah.
We all know Delilah.
We might start role-playing. We might, but we know that can't really go anywhere. That story can't get to a point where it's really interesting because we're waiting for something else to turn up. So we have two circles in a Venn diagram that interact at the table. The table is something else groups discussed quite a lot. And I think the game shop is a good example of where having a dedicated space is very important. It was reassuring to find a lot of this conversation has already happened like 60 years ago about how a church becomes a mass at a particular point in time with incense and song and bells. It has a different purpose then. And we're in a public space right now in a building that's become a private space because we've closed the door, we've got microphones. Role-playing games have a little bit of that sort of mystery around them, curtains that are raised. I used to literally have a GM who would bring in little curtains and he would do a stage. He would gesture with the curtains and then we knew where we were. And there are games that used elements like candles to say, this is now the game space. This is now where we imagine. Before we were just pals, but now this is a performance. Mm-hmm. Having a game shop where at 7:00 we start gaming was really crucial to a lot of the players. This isn't something we do when we're walking. This isn't something we do when we just pass each other. This is something we do in a kind of sacred space.
Mm-hmm. It's always been interesting for me whenever anyone asks, oh, what did you do last night? And I was playing an RPG. It's always like, well, we went down to these caves and we did this and we were in the tavern and this happened. And I once had someone when I was first saying it go, but did you really do those things? I was like, no, we sat around a table for 4 hours and talked at each other. But that like mental almost trick that you get by being in that space of not remembering the specific place you were sitting and how someone was pointing at you or anything else like that. But your imagination totally takes over once you have that space that is separate than your sort of real life, I guess, in lots of ways.
There were terms I found out in my initial literary research. So that phase of a project where you're trying to find if anybody else has talked about this before. And this is a phrase I hadn't seen used in role-playing games, but it's so good. Cognitive quarantine.
Yeah.
So you're playing a guy and your guy is in pain. You're not in pain, but you're imagining that very hard. Mm-hmm. Or you might be imagining a plot line for your character and you're not bringing that to the table. You might be experiencing something you yourself are not experiencing, or you might be experiencing physical pain. Maybe you got a cold. Your character doesn't. Mm-hmm. And you are kind of, as a unique element of the hobby, you are splitting off those multiple scenes, those multiple experiences and characteristics in your head. That's odd. That's an odd thing to do. And there were comparisons between that and like how we dream. Freud got into it, that when we dream, we might have slightly different morals, slightly different identities. We're definitely in a different space. And how we tell stories about that dream we had last night is a way of recontextualizing a very difficult and unique experience for other people. That's, if I told you about my dream last night, I'm not going to.
I really want to know.
It was fine. It was shopping.
If Delilah was there.
Delilah, jeez.
So I was telling you about my dream last night. Just retelling that for you draws out the bits of the dream that were interesting to me. But that's not the full experience. When we went to the caverns, that wasn't the full experience.
So speaking of your 1,000 sessions plus, I'm curious about, one of the topics we wanted to dig into was like new games, bringing new people in, and I know that you're quite interested in that as a subject. How do you bring new people into the hobby? Not only just role playing games, but for board games, any kind of tabletop games. have you experienced certain types? I'm quite curious about mechanics, but have you experienced certain types of mechanics or certain types of role-playing games that you think are particularly well suited to bringing new people into the hobby as a universal approach, or does it very much depend on the people, the group, the interests?
It's really interesting because you mentioned like a jam session for musicians earlier, and they can only get away with that creative jam session because they have a basis of, we know what notes work with each other, we know what chords. There's a music language underneath it all that can allow these jam sessions to go ahead. I don't know if you feel like there's one attached to RPGs, kind of following on from what Gelb was saying.
One of the outcomes of this study was, as GMs, we don't know if anybody else is having fun. This has really stuck with this has been a phantom for me for a year now. We don't know, looking at somebody else at a table, if they really enjoy themselves. They could be polite. They could be saying, "This was good, I'd like to do more." They could be flattering you. But that doesn't mean that we can just absolve ourselves of the responsibility to kind of pay attention and see if everybody's having a good time. I think you can set the scene for that in a role-playing game. I now always ask players to introduce each other. In my study, one of the participants talked about that kind of first 10 minutes of just chatting when he meets new players, so everybody can get a little bit of a sense of themselves. That'd be the sort of thing you do at a party. Mm. I like games that have quite broad strokes. I like a lot of story games where the ideas are kind of easy to get your head around. They might be real world and soapy rather than necessarily a science fiction setting or a fantasy setting, because I find those genres and our understanding of those genres can vary too much. If I say I'm running a horror game, what horror game am I thinking of? Is it True Detective? Is it a slasher? So I find some of those, if I'm meeting new players, a little harder to build up. So I like Contenders, for example. Contenders is a game where people play boxers. I've run it a bunch of times, one of my favorites. I'm not interested in boxing. I don't expect any player to be interested in boxing. There's cultural support from movies like Rocky where people understand the broad strokes, and that's enough. And it has a built-in sort of beginning, middle, and end. You can get through in 2 hours. That's quite good. So you feel more or less satisfied.
I will say that we were at Tabletop Scotland 2 years ago, and John Dodd, who is one of the people who runs Dragon Meat, if you're familiar with him, he was, don't know why, I don't think he was supposed to, but one of the RPG people running the tables were sick or something like that. So he filled in. And so our group had a scheduled time, and my wife loves RPGs. I don't play a lot of them, but enjoy them when I do. I'm not a huge, I don't know all the rules. I need a bit of help with that. And then we had a friend who had never played one before. So we were all different kind of levels. And fortunately, we had John there, and he just sat down and he said, "Do you know Blade Runner? Do you know Alien? Do you know those films?" "Yeah, we like them." "Okay, so we're going to do a mashup of those." And he sat there and he said, write on a piece of paper, pick 5 numbers. And these are your 3 abilities. So you have your paper. So each of us had 10 characters, as in written characters on a piece of paper. And that was all we needed for the actual RPG. And then he just started, clearly like a master in just coming up with stuff off the top of his head. But what I loved about that was, even though the subject matter was really approachable, because you're like, all right, they're going to be aliens. There's probably going to be some elements from Blade Runner and stuff like that. But the mechanics, that question was just taken out of it. You didn't need to know any of that kind of stuff. And so, yes, it meant that there wasn't going to be able to be maybe a sense of depth in terms of the development that we could get into. He gave us, 10 minutes to come up with a little quick character, and he gave us a couple rules that we had to focus on. But I was amazed at that experience, because that was then a 3-hour experience that was on less than an A4 page of written aide-de-memoirs that we all had to have. And he just gave us a dice, whatever it was. And it was fantastic as a way of just not letting mechanics get in the way of diving in so that you could experience the story. And so I was curious about, have you had some kind of experiences, or do you see certain things work or not work when you're bringing people in?
I think it's important to remind people that we're not expecting to get much out of this.
Yeah.
a sociable, funny, friendly couple of hours is great. To treat it like I really like going to the pub, but to treat it like a really good evening in the pub where you just chat to some guy at the bar and share a couple of anecdotes, that's good. I find a couple of things help me get there. One is a technique I've used where everybody at the table comes up with a few potential characters, and then you might choose anything from that pool. That helps remind you that you don't have to have the best idea, and you might be inspired by somebody else's concept. So the Contenders game set in Aberdeen in 1981, a depressing setting. And somebody had an idea for a farmhand. Somebody had an idea for a guy who just come off the rigs. We had a teacher, various other elements that people had that they were drawn from TV, from movies, their own experiences. It helps distance you from your PC if you haven't had to come up with all the ideas. Mm-hmm. So riffing and taking full ownership for your perfect character, perfect mechanics, and that your character has to win somehow, often helps relax players.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Really interesting.
It's crazy. I, weirdly enough, I'm kind of on the opposite sides of these things because particularly when it comes to the setting side of stuff, you're saying having like a modern day or like a kind of an easier realistic thing. Having run a lot of things for a lot of beginners, I flip the other way completely. As ridiculous as possible gets people out of their regular day-to-day headspace is what I've found with just the sessions that I've run. So with a lot of beginner stuff that has come through, I will go for something like the fantastic Grant Howitt's Honey Heist, where you're playing criminal bears. Everyone's a criminal bear. You have a bear stat and a criminal stat, and they kind of balance each other out. And you're working to do a heist in HoneyCon 2017, trying to steal honey from a bee convention. And if your stat goes too far into bear, you become a feral bear. You go and try and eat people. If you go too far into criminal, you turn on the rest of the heist group and you try and get the honey for yourself. So it's ridiculous. I think people know what bees are. They know what bears are. But within this context, I find a huge, huge joy from a GM of people seeing that differently. Even as you say, there's a lot of different fantasy touchstones and things. You go into a fantasy world. What are people seeing it like? I love that. I love the fact they see it differently because they will bring stuff up that I won't have been thinking of at the time, but that will spring ideas on me as a GM. And I may be very unusual in this, but I sit in the high improvisation side of GMing where I don't like doing a lot of prep mainly because players do what they want and half of the prep goes to waste because they choose to do a different thing. I remember doing one session where I had a whole bunch of plot lines and left this tavern and the players ignored all of them and took over the tavern. I then ran a little campaign of tavern economy where they were trying to get in enough drinks that didn't get drunk by all the patrons until I managed to bring the plot lines back to kind of get the king taking over the tavern and they had to deal with that. But I find that giving players, the player choosing to make their own player gives someone something to hold on to, I think, within a fantastical world. So maybe that's where the difference comes in, because it's not a world that you understand completely, or it is something strange. Having something going, I chose this is me, they have that life raft to hold on to in the sea of insanity that will happen, as opposed to having no way of knowing what exactly is going on. I get definitely the creative thing of joining in with other people in that creation thing, but I quite like it when it's funny. I remember one of the first D&D games that I played with a lot of old friends who I had who'd never played D&D before, and they all chose characters who had tragic backstories. Because that's your first D&D session, right? They all had 2 swords and were rogues and had their parents killed by some mysterious force. But it was great to see because they all chose that independently, and it actually created a huge amount of fun and interest with the story due to all the fact that all of their parents had been killed in mysterious circumstances and that they got into that as a group. So I find that the character creation is actually a really important thing for someone to have something to hold on to for themselves. But also, I've always found a modern day setting, people's lives are very different within modern day, and they can actually see that very different. At least if I'm putting it in somewhere fantasy or sci-fi or a crazy world that I've made up on the spot made of jelly beans or whatever, they will have their own imaginative time with it that will give them personal enjoyment, which has not got anything to do with how I describe it or what I'm saying or what's going on. Whereas with modern day stuff, I think people's own lives can get involved in something that I always feel is it's role playing. You're playing a different role than yourself. You're not seeing the world how you would usually see it because you're playing a character. But people can when you set things in modern day settings.
I think my tastes tend towards real world settings and storylines because I personally find them more engaging. But most of my most memorable experiences in gaming, most enjoyable, are cons. And that's somebody I've just met and have to riff off. That might be a group that has just signed up for a 1-paragraph description on a website. And often, like recently, I ran a game of Mouse Ritter for, I think, 2 players who'd never roleplayed before, who turned up to a mini convention and had 2 hours to spare. And it was fantastic. Really, really good. So much fun. And a broad concept. You had tiny mice with tiny swords dealing with, in their case, the cat that lived in the brewery that you treat like a dragon because they're that big and that scary. There were sugar cults. We're getting back to jelly beans again. There were sugar cults. There was the characters had come from an allotment-based city called Sheddenborough. I was very happy with that.
If you're not throwing puns into your RPG, you're probably not doing it right for one-shots, I would say.
Is that maybe a key purpose of RPGs is just to throw in, because I had Glassglow, which was a sort of bottle-based town for the mice. There was a lot.
I bet Delilah didn't like it.
Delilah.
Right, that's why she wasn't there.
She hates all fun.
Yeah, right.
It's good the show has an enemy already. I'm glad it's not me. So
we'll have Delilah next week. So.
Yeah, you'll become the enemy then. Yeah.
So the high concept ideas of your mice, your bears, they're all very good for bringing people together. But that's not the only way because we don't know what people like. And when you mentioned earlier about Critical Role, if people have come from an expectation that performance is very important. Actually, what I found out was it's good to remember that just sitting at a table thinking to yourself, I'm a mouse, I'm a mouse, I'm a mouse, here's what my backstory is, that counts as role-playing too. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to deliver anything for it to be good, for you to have an enjoyable experience. I often think about Spotlight. If there's 6 players at the table and a GM, you get a tiny number of minutes per hour to talk.
Yeah.
So with the rest of your time, you just thinking in character is a big part of the experience of role-playing games. So that had better be an interesting character they're thinking about or mulling over or thinking what their next choice is going to be.
It's I think, talk about the Critical Role side of stuff as well. I love it for getting new people into the hobby. I think it's really, really great, but it has put a huge expectation on newcomers who have seen that and gone, oh, I really want to give it a go. And to not have that experience, not have a big theater-sized thing where people are wearing costumes or able to think on their feet super quickly. Like that's never been what it's about for me. But I've had a couple of people be disappointed sometimes that it's not that. But
I'm never ever going to do a silly voice in a game.
Oh,
just not.
I do them all the time.
You're very good at it.
I love doing it. It's part of the fun for me, but that's where the improvisation, because I never plan these voices in advance. So suddenly someone sounds a bit weirdly South African at some point, and then I just got to roll with it because I've done that foolishly. But I also think that people come in as well as with that focus on theater, but with a focus on, okay, this is going to be something that will last years. This is going to be a campaign. And I find it crazy when so many new people come to the shop, particularly, or to any other session that I'm running, never played before, with that thought of, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be this same character for all of these years, or there's going to be these tragic backstories and things like that. And then to be met with, no, we're doing Criminal Bears or some small scale thing and do a one shot. And then when they realize what it is, which is usually, I think people only take that moment to think after the session is over. That first session, they have gone into it, close their eyes, hope for the best, and then you lead them through this thing, and then they come out at the end and there's this wonderful moment of, oh, that's what this is. And I don't think you can get that without actually trying something completely different, completely new, without that focus on, right, I need to know all the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. I need to have done all this prep before I can even join the first game. And I think that can actually be a detraction from a lot of these games, to not be able to realize where this actual kind of fun and enjoyment of interacting with other people comes from, and what that really means after you've spent 4 hours in a session that's felt like 20 minutes, but you have all these images in your head and this great time that you had and that joke that someone made that was hilarious and that awful time where you murdered a child but you didn't think it was a child, it was just a very short bandit, and oh god, how do we deal with that? And there's those like moments that are just, you can't hit with any other medium that I've found.
Sure. I think an important responsibility there of a GM is the setting of expectations, keeping rhythm, letting everybody know how many sessions you're planning on. This is a 2-hour game is so good, and sticking to those 2 hours is great at cons because people have other places to be. I find it much easier to roleplay if I know where the time limit's going to be, so I can build up some momentum or have my character freak out in a horror game and fill that space with an arc for my character. We played my regular group, we had a game recently that we didn't really talk about at the beginning how long it was going to last. And it looked then, at the pace we were playing, it was going to take another 1.5 years. And that was a lot for a game that we were liking but not loving generally. If instead we'd said, you know what, let's just give this 4 weeks and see what we think. We can always keep going.
Yeah, I was talking to someone, even I think it was only a couple of nights ago, who said that, oh yeah, they're going to get back into their campaign after they finished off this other guy's one shot that they were doing. And I was like, well, it's a one shot. If you're not fit, he was like, no, we're 4 weeks in. And it was like, yeah, that happens. If as a GM, you have to be so aware of the time and trying to get your thing. But with all of that prep, with all of that thing of this is the kind of overall arc that I want to get to, the amount of times I've run something and then it's been, I remember one time where I had zero prep because one of our DMs had dropped out, and I ran something that I'd never run before, and I had really worried that I didn't have enough stuff for it because I was like, oh, I've got these 2 or 3 points to hit and that's it. How am I going to fill this time? They're meant to be here for a 3-hour session. I've really got 2 things for them to do. And then I remember about an hour in, this was called The Witch is Dead. It's another fantastic one shot. They were all tiny familiars of a witch who's been killed by a witchfinder, and they have to go and hunt this witchfinder down. An hour in, they were still in the witch's cottage trying to open a drawer. And I was like, they've been trying to open this drawer for 10 minutes. They're talking between them. I think I have enough stuff. And then I've had other ones where I planned all this stuff and it's been like, oh, they'll get to this point. They haven't even got to the first village by the end of the first session. So I think it's a really interesting learning curve for DMs who are running lots of games and lots of different ones to learn how to pace that, you know, and particularly with lots of different people with different, not skill levels, but levels of familiarity. Yeah. To give everyone that time to play, to be their character or be quiet within that situation if that's what they feel like their character would do. But it's very easy for someone who is playing an overbearing character or is just quite an overbearing personality to kind of take over that game. Have you had any times where you're like, I need to take the focus away from this person and put it over here for this person who hasn't spoken for the last hour?
Yeah, I think that's my biggest responsibility. I like, for example, initiative systems where everybody's thinking about what they're doing next and not waiting for the next person in turn, not waiting for half an hour until it comes around to them again. I did have a game recently where I put a lot of work in. I'd written and recorded a song and was ready to sing it. And that's not something I've done very often. And the players with like 10 minutes to go said, you know what, we like that, the adventure of the missing opera singer, but how would we do plot B instead? And I had to say, that's not ready. And you said yesterday you wanted to talk to the opera singer, and I have a song.
They were disappointed you had a song ready.
Players.
Delilah.
I like finishing games a little quicker. I don't want a one shot to turn into a 4-shot. Mm-hmm. I would never want to sort of get towards the finale and realize we'll have to go home and try and encourage players to turn up next week to do something. I still find pacing very, very difficult. So one of the tools I like using is very specific scenes. We don't just talk until we're done. I say, let's have a scene where everybody's talking about where we're going to explore next. Or let's have a scene where we're all in the tavern. And we cut constantly between the interesting bits without a whole lot of walking to the woods, walking from the woods, talking to the doorman. I want to cut direct like a movie to the punchiest scenes.
it's weird because the character development and growth between just players, not with the GM interacting, I often find happens in those in-between things. It's that thing of when you are walking through the forest and it's like, right, well, go ahead. And people will come up with those weird arguments that have nothing to do with anything due to their own character stuff. So that does fill up the time hugely. And that's where it can take away from this pacing that you're going for sure. But it's where I've found the greatest attachment that people will have to their players has kind of come from. And I love that attachment. When someone comes away, there's nothing more delightful than killing off a player who loves the character that they have. I know that's a horrible thing to say. It's incredibly cruel, but it is a weird thing of that's where the rules come in to kind of mess with them, because you're never planning on killing a person. It can just happen due to the rules. And what can really happen is someone gets really upset, but in a way that watching a really sad film gets someone upset. You know, there's a catharsis that's attached to it. There's a moment of realizing the reality and seriousness of the situation in something that is silly and lighthearted or attached to different things that really hits that human part of me that I love as a GM, hate as a player. But as a GM, it's kind of a secret joy of mine, I reckon.
When you're talking about this, it feels like there's this tension between, are you having tentpole moments so that you can make sure that the pace is going along well, versus are you allowing a little bit more free-flowing nature in the hopes that people are using that as an opportunity to get deeper into the game and develop the character a bit more? Does it, though, matter what game you're playing in terms of whether or not that is appropriate or not? Because I've never played it, but I know someone who's very into Cyberpunk, the Cyberpunk RPG, and there's a lot of things you have to do, and they are not very interested as much in character development and conversations. They want it to keep moving because they have a job to do. I don't really know if it's the person who's just that's his style. That's what he likes, or if it's the game itself that encourages or discourages that type of interaction. Some people have said older Dungeons and Dragons versions versus newer ones, for example. Some people like a different style of gameplay. Do either of you think that that's the case, or is it universal?
I prefer a lot of story games, which tend to have scene-based structure, tend to have a strong sense of genre, push players to make moral decisions, and push interesting conflicts. And also allow the players to, for example, say, I'm going to have a flashback now to, I've just made a decision. I've just declared war. I don't know why. I want a flashback to figure out what my reasoning was for that. And so you can play around in a very cinematic way with cause and effect, with characters having secrets from each other, but players not. So that's a kind of gaming that not everybody does and not everybody likes. But I find those punchy moments, not just tentpole, not just necessarily the most exciting moment in the movie, not necessarily the fight scene. I'd be happy if we never had a fight scene in a role-playing game ever again. I like conflict, but not necessarily those kind of broad strokes. I like to aim straight for them and then let the players figure out their pacing and if they need to have a gentle conversation afterwards. I find that ebb and flow more interesting for me.
It is a thing of once you've GM'd a few things, you lose a little bit of the stress that is I don't know how to do this. And instead that becomes a focus more on, all right, how do I want to do this that I will enjoy this too?
We can't be everything to everybody.
Exactly. That's the thing. And everyone is interested in different things. So to answer your question a bit, Gil, for me, it's very much a mix of player and mechanics. So this is why a lot of people come into it going, Dungeons and Dragons. I want to play Dungeons and Dragons. And it's like, I get this. It's a cultural touchstone. It's been in Stranger Things, it's popped off a lot during the pandemic and everything else that comes with it. But as a rule set, there's an awful lot going on in that. There are things that most people will not touch, It's and things that can get in the way of the pure enjoyment of narrative storytelling. So I will often sit on, even if I'm not doing one shots, I'll do something Mortborg or wonderful sort of more narrative Troika or Into the Odd or something like that, where really you're sitting with something that has 3 or 4 statistics max. You're rolling a d6 or a d20 and your system is based off that. So everyone understands what happens. They roll that d20, they hit a 12, they add their 4, it's 16. What does that mean? They know that immediately. They don't have to look to me and I don't have to look through a bunch of tables to figure out what that actually means. It either means you have a huge grasp of the rules in advance, so you don't have to look that side of stuff, and they have a huge grasp of those or grab of those rules as well. With stuff like Cyberpunk, like your friend, if it's a system everyone knows, everyone loves, you're loving the bits and pieces and how they tie together, awesome. I think that's really, really good. I think for entry-level newcomers, anyone who's just even in a new group but has been playing for 10 years, like having something a little bit lighter on the rule set and heavier on the narrative side is just easier for everyone to get into. It also allows a lot more improvisation from a GM side. If you have something which is very strict with rules and you've planned a whole bunch of stuff, often it goes off the rails. You then have to come up with stuff anyway. So it's kind of like, I find that the narrative or the lighter rule sets just are something I'm personally more interested in. And that's always the way. There are a lot of people who disagree with me. There's a fair few people who come into the shop going, right, what is this rule set that has some depth to it? I want that crunch. And it's like, great, there's Imperium Maledictum. If you like your Warhammer 40k stuff, which is actually still fairly rules light, but is based off Dark Heresy, which is quite rules heavy. Sorry?
Rules Heresy.
Did I say Rules Heresy?
No.
Oh God. Sorry. There is also well-known Dark Eye, which is huge in Germany and Europe mainly. But we had some people play it in the shop and come in as a group, which they already had. They came in, all of them had their laptops. And I didn't see them speak very much to each other, but they had a great time. And and it's really interesting to go, okay, that's probably not for me, but they loved how many statistics. And Pathfinder has a similar thing with having a lot of stuff going on in that, which is great if you want to elaborate a narrative through mechanics. I personally like to elaborate a narrative through kind of like yourself, Joe, character development and everything else that comes through it, and the stuff that the players do that I don't expect. And that makes me the happiest more than anything else as a GM in a RPG, is when someone goes, oh, can I do this? And it's like, it's something I've never thought of before, but I'm never going to say no to that. I'm going to say yes, but this might happen by you doing that. Or but there will be consequences. And having that side of things where people feel like they're hugely interacting in not only their own character, not only the story that you were telling, but the story that they're telling and their characters within the kind of team of other characters as well. It's the most delightful part of it all. And I will always finish an RPG session and go, as a DM at least, and go, I don't remember what I said. I don't remember the words that I said. I remember roughly the points that all those players hit, but they will tell me next week, oh, this happened. And I won't remember at all, because you're thinking too much and you're just going through it all and you just know that you really enjoyed it and you're very tired.
I'm really glad the players are there, because I would not remember anything either. I love having them recall and tell their own stories about the important bits. There was a game I was reading this week called Grimwild, which is a narrative fantasy game. And one of the mechanics I really liked was, if the knight's slaying a dragon, it might just be a roll and a montage, because it's not very important to see the knight kill a dragon. But if the thief does it, that's a full scene. If the knight's picking a lock, he's sweating, and that's a long scene for him with lots of game mechanics focused in. So the game kind of hovers in and out, changes focus constantly. I quite like that, and I quite like giving that to players, so they can say, you know what, I really care about this scene. There was a game I liked called The Shadow of Yesterday that has a game mechanic called Bringing the Pain, where if the player doesn't like the result of a roll, they can say, you know what, let's skip back 5 seconds and turn that into the next 20 minutes of gaming.
Oh dear. So yeah, I mean, it's always fantastic to talk to you about RPGs. I did want to pick your brain a little bit about board games as well, because you play a fair amount of different games that come through the shop. I wanted to kind of focus down on this idea that we were talking about with RPGs and talk about easy or at least entry level games and getting groups in as well, adding to what your research was about and getting new groups into playing board games. Do you think that there's a very different mentality attached to it than it is of groups coming into RPGs, just from a personal perspective as opposed to kind of research or anything? Because you do have that like mechanic that you are focused purely on that everyone is being described for the first time usually if you're all getting into it new. Does that make it easier to join a group attached to that? Or is there a different barrier of entry because of that rules learning necessity?
One of the themes that came out of my study was how concerned people are with their status when they join a new role-playing group. So one of the participants had been good. He'd had a consistent group. He'd moved somewhere else. And he worried that people would underestimate him, perhaps. I don't think you get that in board games to the same degree, unless it's I'm thinking of one board game group I joined where they would every week play a game called like 1812. It was an extremely detailed German board game. Mm-hmm. And they would play it competitively for money. And the first time we went, my wife won. And they asked her to rescore all her scores because they didn't believe her. And we never saw them again. So I don't think you're bringing that same sense of sort of competitiveness that you might get with, like, I don't know, a poker group or a chess club. You're not typically getting that with these games. Mm-hmm. And if it's a game that's low stakes and quick and it takes 30 minutes or an hour, that's not a concern.
Yeah.
If it's an all afternoon thing, or you're playing, I don't know, Dune or Battlestar Galactica, then you might be considering your not just your status, but your reputation and your ego.
Has that come up? Because I know that you're, as you mentioned earlier, a big proponent of Crokinole, which is a joy of a game. It's basically
it's a wonderful game I'm not good at.
It's a wonderful game where you're flicking wooden pieces across a circular board, kind of like tiny wooden curling, where you're trying to knock other pieces out. A little bit shuffleboardy.
Shuffleboard, air hockey.
But much smaller in scale for the pieces at least. So it means anyone can just flick these things and they slide across the thing like a very well brushed curling stone across ice. And it's fantastic, but it's a pure dexterity game. So there is very little rules learning in that, which is what I find is the best entry-level games. We've got a Crokinole board in the shop, which we bring down every so often, and it's just great fun. There's a few other games like Archduke and other games that we have in that are super easy to learn. So it's one that is straightforward to get on the table. Within 2 minutes, you've explained it to people, but the practical act of playing the game is much harder, particularly with dexterity games and things. Is this something, you just said you're not good at it. Is that a joy that you're not good at it? Like, is there something about the fact... No,
for everybody else.
the fact that anyone can play this and you can bring it in front of anyone without having to worry of, oh, I know this game too well, I'm just going to win, I need to kind of handicap myself with it.
There's a lot of games, role-playing games too, that I like to bring to players and say, everything's on your sheet. Here's 30 seconds of an explanation, that's it. Here's the dice roll, here are your 3 stats, that's it. There's role-playing games like the 2400 series where you might have 1 stat. And it turned out I could run like a relatively long campaign with that because the characters were so interesting. The gameplay is really interesting. With Crokinole, you can explain it very, very quickly. You can explain it during a person's first game. And they're away. You can just leave them to it. I love that. I love that kind of light touch from me as an instructor or GM. I'm just really bad at it. It's really hard. Playing against, it doesn't help that I play against people who are naturally good and they just clear the board constantly. It's really, really sad. There's a little bit of chance to it where you can kind of excuse yourself for the first 20 games, but after a while you have to be better.
It's similar in a lot of ways to a sport, just in terms of the way that you're kind of describing it. It's relatively simple to learn. If you're really good at it, you will usually beat someone who's not very good at it. But because of the dexterity bit, it's not like a chess type, you're a champion chess player versus a novice. So like for anybody who I know who loves Crokinole, they describe it as like almost, I'm going to go play tennis. I'm going to go play Crokinole.
It's tennis, it's bowling, it's all of those. Yeah. It looks beautiful, which helps. People want to touch it. Cats want to touch it. It makes a nice sound when the pieces click. It's aesthetically very beautiful. That's quite a nice thing to bring out.
Yeah, I think that's why dexterity games, I think, are just such a good thing for newcomers to any games or anything else like that. Everyone understands Jenga, and it's never we're sitting with something for 4 hours and it's still not over yet. It is quick games, but it's based upon not knowledge of rules or mechanics, but actual physical actions. And I do think that's where entry-level games come in a huge, huge way. And we have lots of people coming and playing it in the shop, and I really enjoy them myself, be they dexterity games or super simple card games or things. As long as there is a depth of play long-term, having a game that's done in 15 minutes that takes 30 seconds to explain is just a huge, huge boon for the gaming industry as a whole.
I like game pieces. I think a wonderful thing in role-playing games the last 10 years has been more interesting forms of character sheet where you've got stuff to organize, like Mouse Raiders Inventory, where you're moving little Tetris pieces of swords and backpacks and acorns around in your character sheet. That's a vast improvement. That's so enticing. That's so interesting to look at. Same with battle mats. I've never really played D&D, and I'm jealous every time I pass one. Battle mats and little miniatures, and somebody's painted something and there's a dragon in the middle. Yeah, we understand what's going on. We understand the stakes of that. That's much more interesting and much more appealing to new players than another photocopied character sheet.
Yeah, and it's something that I think we all love to, if we have the time to do it, and the extra resources to get those onto the table to make a sort of spectacle out of what you're doing. It's really, really great to have, and just it's also entices people to get into it, but not necessary. That's the important thing to double down on. To play an RPG, don't need anything except the core rules, some of which are free online, and some of which you can just get the core rules for, and nothing else outside of people's imagination, a pen, a paper, possibly some dice or a pack of cards, and you can have a huge years-long adventure, if you like, based off just that. But if you do want to go to the extra set, that's pretty awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting about these things.
Man.
We'll get you back at some point. We'll talk about more things, even more to do with RPGs, or we will hear from you when you are National Crokinole Champion. We're expecting it any day now. You versus...
I just broke out in a sweat even thinking about playing it. No.
So we'll bring Delilah in. You'll have a real aggression against it. Absolutely perfect. Thank you all for joining us. Spending any of your time listening to us ramble about games is always massively appreciated. And we'll see you next time at Ancient Rebel Games.